This will appear when loneliness is actually protecting your soul. Carl Jung. There's a secret that Carl Jung discovered in his darkest moments of isolation, a truth so profound and so contrary to everything our modern world believes about loneliness that he rarely spoke of it directly to his patients. This secret wasn't written in his published works. It wasn't discussed in his famous seminars. It was whispered only in his private journals and revealed through his own painful journey into the depths of solitude. The secret is this: loneliness isn't a disease to be cured. It isn't a symptom of social failure or psychological dysfunction. Loneliness, when understood correctly, is your soul's most sophisticated defense mechanism, a sacred guardian that appears precisely when your authentic self needs protection from a world that would otherwise consume, distort, or destroy the very essence of who you truly are. Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." But what he didn't tell us in that famous quote is why this communication becomes impossible and what your soul is actually protecting when it wraps you in the cocoon of solitude. Picture this scene from Jung's life. It's 1913, and the man who would become the most influential depth psychologist in history is sitting alone in his study in Küsnacht, Switzerland. His friendship with Freud has shattered. His colleagues view him as a heretic. His revolutionary ideas about the unconscious mind have isolated him from the academic establishment. He's experiencing what he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of such intense psychological isolation that he questioned his own sanity. But here's what's remarkable. Instead of desperately seeking social connection to escape this loneliness, Jung did something that would change psychology forever. He listened to it. He recognized that this profound isolation wasn't happening to him. It was happening for him. His psyche was creating a sacred space, a protective boundary between his emerging authentic self and a world that wasn't ready to understand what he was becoming. In those lonely months, Jung began to develop his most groundbreaking concepts: the collective unconscious, archetypal psychology, the process of individuation. None of these insights could have emerged while he was surrounded by the comfortable consensus of his former social circle. His loneliness wasn't punishing him, it was incubating the very ideas that would eventually heal millions of people. This is the forbidden teaching that mainstream psychology doesn't want you to understand. Your loneliness might not be a problem to solve, but a process to honor. We live in a culture that has weaponized your fear of being alone, convincing you that solitude equals failure, that being by yourself means something is fundamentally wrong with you. Every self-help book, every therapy session, every well-meaning friend tells you the same thing. You need to get out more, you need to connect, you need to be social. But what if they're wrong? What if your soul knows something they don't? Consider for a moment the possibility that your periods of loneliness aren't random suffering but carefully orchestrated retreats. Think about the last time you felt truly, deeply alone, not just physically isolated, but emotionally and spiritually separate from everyone around you. Can you remember what was happening in your life at that time? Were you going through a transition? Were you questioning beliefs you'd held for years? Were you sensing that some part of your identity was no longer serving you? Here's what Jung discovered that he could barely articulate even to himself. The soul has its own timing, its own seasons of growth and dormancy. Just as a seed must remain hidden in the dark soil before it can sprout, there are aspects of your authentic self that can only develop in the protective darkness of solitude. The loneliness you experience isn't evidence of your inadequacy. It's evidence of your soul's intelligence. Modern civilization has created what Jung called a neurosis of our time. a collective forgetting of the sacred purpose of solitude. We've built a world of constant stimulation, endless connectivity, and perpetual noise because we've lost touch with the transformative power of silence. We fear loneliness so deeply that we'll accept toxic relationships, mind-numbing entertainment, and soul-crushing conformity just to avoid spending a single evening alone with our own thoughts. But your psyche is wiser than the culture that raised you. When it wraps you in loneliness, it's not abandoning you. It's protecting something precious that's trying to emerge. It's creating a sacred boundary between your authentic self and all the external forces that would shape you into something you're not meant to be. Think of loneliness as your soul's way of saying, "Stop. Don't take on any more input right now. Don't let anyone else's opinions, expectations, or energies influence you. What's trying to be born within you is too delicate, too important, too uniquely yours to be shaped by outside forces. You need to be alone right now so you can discover who you really are." This reframe changes everything. Instead of seeing your lonely periods as evidence of social failure, you begin to recognize them as invitations to psychological treasure. Instead of desperately seeking distraction from your solitude, you begin to approach it with the reverence of someone entering a sacred temple. But here's the crucial distinction that Jung made and that most people miss. There's a profound difference between loneliness as soul protection and loneliness as soul abandonment. Protective loneliness feels like a retreat into something deeper, even when it's painful. Abandonment loneliness feels like exile from everything meaningful, including yourself. Protective loneliness often comes with a strange sense of rightness. Even when you don't understand what's happening, you might feel sad or confused, but underneath there's a knowing that this isolation serves a purpose. You find yourself naturally pulling back from social obligations that once seemed important. You lose interest in conversations that once engaged you. You feel like you're being prepared for something, though you don't know what. Abandonment loneliness, on the other hand, feels like being cut off from your own life force. It's characterized by despair, hopelessness, and a sense that you're fundamentally flawed or unlovable. This type of loneliness isn't protective. It's a symptom of disconnection from your authentic self, often caused by years of living someone else's version of who you should be. Jung spent his life helping people distinguish between these two types of solitude, though he rarely used such direct language. He understood that the soul sometimes needs to be alone, not because it's broken, but because it's on the verge of breakthrough. The loneliness that protects your soul feels like being called inward toward something important. The loneliness that abandons your soul feels like being pushed outward toward desperate connection with anything that might fill the void. Here's what I want you to consider as we journey together through this exploration. What if your most lonely periods weren't your darkest hours, but your most sacred ones? What if the times when you felt most isolated from others were actually the times when you were closest to discovering your authentic self? What if your soul knew exactly what it was doing when it wrapped you in the protective cocoon of solitude? This isn't about romanticizing isolation or avoiding healthy human connection. This is about recognizing that your psyche has wisdom that transcends social conditioning. It's about understanding that some of life's most important work can only happen in solitude, and that your soul will create whatever conditions are necessary to protect that work. As we explore this forbidden teaching together, you'll discover why Jung believed that the capacity for sacred solitude is one of the hallmarks of psychological maturity. You'll understand why the people who have contributed most to human consciousness, the artists, philosophers, spiritual teachers, and innovators, have all had profound relationships with solitude. And most importantly, you'll learn to recognize when your loneliness is actually your soul's way of saying something beautiful is trying to be born within you, and I'm creating the perfect conditions for that birth. The culture tells you to fear being alone. Your soul tells you to honor it. The question is, which voice will you listen to? Because once you understand the sacred purpose of loneliness, your entire relationship with solitude transforms from suffering into sanctuary, from isolation into initiation, from problem into profound spiritual practice. Jung kept this secret because he knew that most people weren't ready to hear it. He knew that in a world obsessed with external connection, the idea that solitude could be sacred would sound like heresy. But you're here, listening to these words, which means some part of you already suspects what Jung discovered in his darkest hours, that loneliness isn't your enemy, it's your soul's most faithful guardian. We are living through the most connected yet loneliest period in human history. This isn't an accident, it's the result of a systematic weaponization of your fundamental human need for connection. Modern civilization has created a sophisticated trap that keeps you constantly stimulated, yet perpetually empty, endlessly linked to others, yet profoundly isolated from yourself. The epidemic isn't loneliness itself. It's the complete inability to be alone with your own consciousness, without immediately reaching for a device, a distraction, or another human being to fill the space. We've created a culture so addicted to external stimulation that the natural rhythm of solitude and connection has been completely shattered. Here's the disturbing truth. Your fear of loneliness has been deliberately cultivated to keep you consuming, connecting, and conforming. Every social media platform, every dating app, every community that promises to cure your isolation is actually designed to deepen your dependence on external validation while preventing you from ever developing a genuine relationship with your own inner world. Consider this. When was the last time you spent an entire day without any form of external entertainment or social interaction? Not because you were depressed or avoiding people, but simply to see what would emerge from the depths of your own consciousness when given complete silence and space. If that question makes you uncomfortable, if your first thought is, "But why would I want to do that?" then you're experiencing exactly what this culture has conditioned you to feel. You've been trained to believe that solitude is punishment, that being alone with your thoughts is somehow dangerous or unproductive, that your value as a human being is measured entirely by your capacity to maintain relationships and social connections. But Jung understood something that our hyper-connected world has forgotten. The quality of your relationship with others is entirely dependent on the quality of your relationship with yourself, and you cannot develop that relationship while you're constantly receiving input from external sources. Let me tell you about Sarah, a successful marketing executive who came to understand this principle in the most profound way. On the surface, Sarah was everything our culture tells us we should be. Her social calendar was packed every weekend. She had over 3,000 followers on Instagram. She was constantly texting, calling, meeting, networking, socializing. She never ate a meal alone, never went to a movie by herself, never spent an evening without plans. Sarah was also dying inside. She couldn't sleep without podcasts playing in her earbuds. She couldn't drive without music or talk radio. She couldn't take a shower without her phone nearby in case someone needed her. The idea of spending even an hour in complete silence filled her with a panic so intense that she once drove to 3 different coffee shops just to avoid being alone in her apartment. Sarah's hyperconnection wasn't connecting her to anything real. It was an elaborate escape mechanism from the growing realization that she had no idea who she actually was beneath all the social performance. Every relationship in her life was based on the version of herself that she presented to keep others engaged, entertained, or impressed. She had become so skilled at reading other people's expectations and mirroring them back that she'd lost all contact with her own authentic desires, opinions, and feelings. This is what Jung called living in persona, becoming so identified with the mask you wear in social situations that you forget there's a real person underneath. But Sarah's case was even more extreme than Jung could have imagined, because modern technology had made it possible to never, ever remove the mask. She could maintain her social persona 24 hours a day through constant digital connection. The breakthrough came during a power outage that lasted 3 days. Sarah's phone died, her internet was down, and for the first time in years, she was forced into complete solitude and silence. The first day was agony. She felt like she was literally dying from the absence of external stimulation. But on the second day, something extraordinary began to happen. She started to remember things she'd forgotten about herself. She remembered that she used to love painting. She remembered that she'd once written poetry. She remembered dreams and aspirations that had been buried under years of social obligation and external validation seeking. By the third day, she was experiencing something she hadn't felt since childhood, genuine curiosity about her own inner world. When the power came back on, Sarah made a decision that her friends thought was a mental breakdown. She deleted her social media accounts, cleared her social calendar, and spent the next 3 months learning to be alone with herself. It was the most terrifying and transformative period of her life. This is the pattern that Jung observed in his most successful patients. They all had to learn to distinguish between authentic connection and addictive stimulation. They had to develop what he called the capacity for solitude, the ability to be genuinely comfortable in their own psychological space without needing constant input from others. But our modern world has made this capacity almost impossible to develop naturally. We're bombarded from birth with the message that solitude is loneliness, that being alone means being rejected, that your worth is determined by how many people want to spend time with you. The result is a generation of people who are connected to everything but themselves. They know how to network but not how to self-reflect. They can maintain hundreds of online relationships but can't sit comfortably in a room by themselves for an hour. They're experts at reading social cues, but complete strangers to their own emotional landscape. This isn't an accident. Consumer capitalism depends on your inability to be content with what you already have, including your own company. If you were genuinely comfortable with solitude, if you could find deep satisfaction in your own thoughts and feelings, you wouldn't need to constantly purchase experiences, objects, or connections to feel fulfilled. The loneliness epidemic isn't caused by lack of connection. It's caused by lack of authentic self-relationship masked as hyperconnection. People are lonelier than ever, not because they're isolated, but because they're constantly connected to everything except their own authentic self. Jung predicted this in his later writings when he warned about the mass man, the person who becomes so identified with collective thinking and social roles that individual consciousness atrophies. What he couldn't have predicted was how technology would accelerate this process exponentially. Now we have people who literally cannot be alone with their thoughts for more than a few minutes without experiencing what psychologists call solitude anxiety, a panic response to the absence of external stimulation. They've become so dependent on constant input that their own consciousness feels foreign and threatening. But here's what the culture doesn't want you to know. This inability to be alone isn't a personality trait or a character flaw. It's a learned behavior that can be unlearned. You weren't born needing constant stimulation. You were conditioned to need it by a system that profits from your dependence. Your original relationship with solitude was one of natural curiosity and exploration. As a child, you could spend hours lost in your own imagination, creating worlds and stories that emerged from the depths of your unconscious mind. You didn't need external entertainment because you had access to the infinite creativity of your own psyche. That capacity is still there, buried beneath years of conditioning that taught you to fear the very source of your creativity, authenticity, and genuine self-knowledge. The loneliness you feel isn't evidence that you need more connection. It's evidence that you need to reconnect with the part of yourself that can only be accessed in solitude. This is why Jung insisted that the therapeutic process requires periods of withdrawal from social influence. Healing doesn't happen in groups or through constant interaction. It happens in the quiet spaces between thoughts, in the moments when you're not performing for anyone, not trying to be understood by anyone, not seeking validation from anyone. The modern epidemic isn't loneliness. It's the complete inability to access the transformative power of chosen solitude. And until you recognize this distinction, you'll remain trapped in the cycle of seeking external connection to fill a void that can only be filled from within. Comment below if you recognize this pattern in yourself. Do you reach for your phone the moment you feel uncomfortable with silence? Can you eat a meal without any form of entertainment or stimulation? How long can you sit alone with your thoughts before you feel compelled to connect with someone else? Your answers to these questions will reveal whether you've developed what Jung considered essential for psychological maturity, a genuine friendship with your own consciousness. Because until you can be truly alone without feeling lonely, you'll never be truly connected even when you're surrounded by people. There's a moment in every person's psychological development when they realize with horror that they've become a stranger to themselves. You wake up one day and recognize that every relationship in your life is based on a performance. Every conversation is a carefully choreographed dance of expectations, and the person everyone thinks they know, the person you've convinced them you are, bears little resemblance to the raw, unfiltered consciousness that exists when no one else is watching. This is what Jung called the persona trap, the gradual but inevitable process by which your social mask becomes your prison. You create a version of yourself that's designed to be likable, successful, and acceptable to others, and then you become so identified with this creation that you lose all contact with your authentic self. The persona isn't inherently evil. It's a necessary tool for navigating social reality. But when it becomes the only version of yourself you know, it transforms from a useful mask into a suffocating cage. Jung wrote, "The persona is a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other to conceal the true nature of the individual." But what he discovered through decades of analytical work is that most people don't just wear the mask, they become the mask. They lose all awareness that there's a real person underneath the social performance. This is where loneliness becomes your soul's emergency intervention. When you've been living so completely in persona that you've forgotten your authentic self exists, your psyche will create circumstances that force you into solitude, stripping away all the external validation and social feedback that keeps the false self alive. The loneliness you experience during these periods isn't punishment, it's liberation disguised as suffering. Let me tell you about David, a networking genius who built his entire identity around being the person everyone wanted to know. David could walk into any room and within minutes identify the most important people, the most interesting conversations, the most strategic connections. He had contacts in every industry, invitations to every exclusive event, and a reputation as the ultimate social catalyst who could introduce you to anyone you needed to meet. David was also completely empty inside. He realized this during what should have been the pinnacle of his social success, a networking event he'd organized that brought together 500 of the most influential people in his city. As he stood on stage giving the opening remarks, looking out at a sea of faces that lit up when they saw him, he felt absolutely nothing. No satisfaction, no connection, no sense of accomplishment, just a hollow recognition that he was performing for people who knew nothing about who he actually was. The realization was so devastating that David excused himself from his own event and drove home, where he spent the next 6 hours sitting in his apartment, trying to remember the last time he'd expressed a genuine opinion, shared a real feeling, or engaged in a conversation that wasn't calculated to maintain his image as the ultimate connector. He couldn't remember a single instance. That night marked the beginning of what David later called his social death, a period of voluntary isolation that lasted almost a year. He stopped networking, stopped attending events, stopped maintaining the hundreds of superficial relationships that had defined his existence. His phone, which used to ring constantly, fell silent. His social calendar, which had been packed months in advance, emptied completely. For the first 3 months, David was convinced he was having a mental breakdown. The silence was terrifying. Without constant social feedback telling him who he was, he felt like he was dissolving. He didn't know how to fill his time, what to think about, or even what he enjoyed doing when no one was watching. The person he'd been for so many years had been entirely constructed from other people's responses to him. But then something remarkable began to happen. In the absence of all external input about who he should be, David started to discover who he actually was. He remembered that he'd once loved astronomy, not because it impressed anyone, but because the vastness of space filled him with wonder. He rediscovered his fascination with philosophy, not as cocktail party conversation material, but as genuine inquiry into the nature of existence. Most importantly, David began to understand the difference between connection and performance. For years, he'd mistaken his ability to charm people for his ability to connect with them. He'd confused being wanted at parties with being genuinely known by other humans. He'd built an entire identity around being socially valuable while becoming personally empty. This is the cruel irony of the persona trap. The more successful you become at managing your social image, the lonelier you actually become. You surround yourself with people who are attracted to your mask, while the real you remains completely unknown, even to yourself. The persona trap is particularly insidious in our current cultural moment because social media has made it possible to maintain and refine your false self with unprecedented precision. You can curate every photo, craft every post, control every impression you make. You can present a version of yourself that's so appealing, so engaging, so seemingly authentic that even you start to believe it's real. But your unconscious mind knows the difference between your authentic self and your social performance, and it will eventually rebel against the exhaustion of constant masking. This rebellion often manifests as sudden, inexplicable loneliness, even when you're surrounded by people who seem to love you. You'll find yourself at parties feeling completely isolated, in relationships feeling fundamentally unknown, receiving praise and recognition that feels meaningless because it's directed at someone who doesn't really exist. This type of loneliness is your soul's way of saying, this isn't sustainable. This isn't who you really are. You need to stop performing and start being. The loneliness that emerges when your persona begins to crack isn't evidence of social failure. It's evidence of psychological health. It's your authentic self finally strong enough to protest against being buried alive under layers of social conditioning and performance anxiety. Jung understood that this process was inevitable for anyone committed to psychological growth. He called it persona breakdown, the necessary collapse of false identity that precedes the emergence of authentic self. But he also knew that most people would do anything to avoid this process, because it requires a period of profound uncertainty where you don't know who you are or how to relate to others. This is why our culture is so terrified of solitude. It's not just about being alone, it's about being alone without the constant reinforcement of your social identity. It's about facing the terrifying question, who am I when no one is watching? Who am I when I'm not trying to impress anyone, please anyone, or be useful to anyone? For most people, these questions feel like psychological death, and in a sense they are. The death of who you thought you were, the death of who others expected you to be, the death of all the social roles and identities that you'd mistaken for your actual self. But Jung knew that this death is actually birth in disguise. On the other side of persona breakdown lies what he called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are rather than who you've been conditioned to be. But this process requires periods of solitude so complete that all the external voices telling you who you should be falls silent, leaving space for your authentic voice to emerge. The persona trap explains why so many successful, popular, seemingly well-connected people experience profound loneliness. They've become so good at being what others want that they've lost all contact with what they actually want. They're surrounded by people who are attracted to their performance, while their real self remains in complete isolation. This is different from the loneliness of social rejection or isolation. This is the loneliness of being known by everyone and understood by no one, including yourself. It's the loneliness of having 1,000 followers and no authentic relationships. It's the loneliness of being invited everywhere while belonging nowhere. If you're experiencing this type of loneliness, the kind where you feel most alone when you're surrounded by people, it's not a sign that something is wrong with you. It's a sign that something is finally right with you. Your authentic self is strong enough to start rejecting the false connections that have been masquerading as real relationships. The solution isn't to become better at social performance or to find new audiences for your persona. The solution is to develop the courage to be genuinely alone until you discover who you are when you're not performing for anyone. This is terrifying work because it means risking the loss of all the relationships that are based on your false self. But here's what Jung discovered and what David learned through his year of social death. The relationships you lose when you stop performing were never real relationships anyway. They were transactions based on mutual performance, agreements to validate each other's personas in exchange for social comfort and belonging. Real relationship, the kind that feeds your soul rather than just entertaining your ego, is only possible when you've developed enough authentic self-knowledge to show up as a real person rather than a social performance. And that self-knowledge can only be developed in solitude, in the sacred space where no one else's expectations can influence who you're becoming. Your loneliness isn't pushing you away from connection. It's calling you toward authentic connection by first demanding that you connect authentically with yourself. And that process, terrifying as it is the only pathway to relationships that nourish your soul, rather than consuming it. In the depths of solitude, when all the distractions fall away and you're left alone with the raw content of your own consciousness, something emerges that you've been unconsciously avoiding your entire life. Your shadow. This isn't the dramatic evil shadow of popular psychology. It's something far more subtle and far more transformative. It's the collection of all the aspects of yourself that you've disowned, denied, or projected onto others because they didn't fit the image you wanted to maintain. Jung discovered that loneliness serves a sacred psychological function. It creates the necessary conditions for shadow integration. When you're constantly surrounded by other people, you can maintain the illusion of who you think you are by unconsciously projecting your disowned qualities onto them. You see anger in others because you can't acknowledge your own rage. You judge laziness in friends because you can't accept your own desire to rest. You criticize neediness in partners because you can't face your own dependency. But in true solitude, not the distracted, entertained kind of alone time, but the raw, unmediated encounter with your own consciousness, these projections begin to collapse. Without other people to serve as screens for your disowned self, you're forced to confront aspects of your personality that you've spent years trying to avoid. This is why genuine solitude can feel so disturbing initially. It's not just the absence of social stimulation that makes you uncomfortable. It's the presence of psychological content that you've been unconsciously keeping at bay through constant external focus. The loneliness that drives you toward distraction isn't just about missing other people. It's about avoiding the parts of yourself that emerge when those people aren't there to absorb your projections. Let me share what happened to Maria, a therapist who prided herself on being endlessly patient, compassionate, and understanding. Maria's professional identity was built around being the person who never got angry, never judged, never responded with anything but empathy and wisdom. She was known among her colleagues as someone who could handle the most difficult clients without ever losing her cool. During a sabbatical that was supposed to be restorative, Maria found herself alone in a cabin for 2 weeks with nothing but books, nature, and her own company. She expected this time to be peaceful and rejuvenating. Instead, it became one of the most challenging experiences of her life. On the 3rd day, sitting by herself with no clients to help and no professional role to maintain, Maria began to notice something unsettling. She was furious, not at anything specific, just filled with a rage so pure and intense that it shocked her. As she sat with this feeling, instead of immediately trying to understand or transform it, memories began surfacing of hundreds of moments when she'd absorbed other people's pain, chaos, and dysfunction while never allowing herself to acknowledge how angry this made her. She realized that her professional compassion, while genuine, had also become a sophisticated defense against her own capacity for righteous anger. She'd been so identified with being understanding that she'd completely disowned her ability to set boundaries, say no, or acknowledge when other people's behavior was genuinely unacceptable. The loneliness she'd been avoiding wasn't just about missing human contact. It was about avoiding the parts of herself that didn't fit her carefully constructed identity as an endlessly patient healer. In solitude, without anyone to be compassionate toward, she had to face the full spectrum of her emotional reality, including the parts she'd been unconsciously rejecting. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness isn't evil. It's simply the aspects of your complete self that you've been unable to integrate because they threaten your ego's carefully maintained self-image. Shadow integration work requires solitude because it's impossible to clearly distinguish between your authentic reactions and your conditioned responses while you're constantly interacting with others. In the presence of people, you automatically slip into familiar roles and patterns. Your shadow remains hidden because you're unconsciously managing your image, even with people you trust completely. But alone, truly alone, you encounter the unfiltered content of your psyche, the jealousy you've been denying, the ambition you've been hiding, the selfishness you've been projecting onto others, the neediness you've been disguising as independence, the controlling tendencies you've been calling caring, the spiritual pride you've been mistaking for genuine growth. This encounter isn't pleasant, but it's profoundly liberating. Each aspect of your shadow that you can consciously acknowledge and integrate becomes available energy that you no longer have to waste on repression and projection. The anger you've been unconsciously carrying transforms into healthy boundary setting. The selfishness you've been denying becomes appropriate self-care. The neediness you've been hiding becomes the capacity for genuine intimacy. Jung discovered that people who cannot tolerate solitude are often people who cannot tolerate their own shadow material. They need constant external stimulation, not just to avoid boredom, but to avoid encountering the parts of themselves that don't match their conscious self-concept. This is why so many people experience what they think is loneliness when they're actually experiencing shadow emergence. The discomfort you feel in solitude isn't always about missing other people. Sometimes it's about meeting aspects of yourself that you've been unconsciously avoiding. Consider Marcus, a spiritual teacher who'd built his entire identity around being evolved beyond ego, anger, and attachment. Marcus taught workshops on transcending negative emotions and living in a state of constant peace and acceptance. His followers saw him as someone who'd achieved a level of consciousness that most people could only aspire to. During a retreat where he was supposed to be in silence for 10 days, Marcus encountered something that shattered his spiritual self-image. Raw, unadulterated envy. Not the mild jealousy he could easily rationalize away, but a deep, burning resentment toward other teachers who had larger followings, more recognition, more financial success. For days, Marcus tried to meditate this feeling away, to transform it into something more spiritually acceptable. But in the enforced silence and solitude of the retreat, he couldn't escape the truth. He was deeply competitive, desperately wanted recognition, and had been using spiritual concepts to hide his ego rather than actually transcending it. This realization was devastating to his identity, but transformative to his authenticity. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like a real person rather than a spiritual performance. The loneliness he'd been avoiding through constant teaching and interaction with students had been protecting him from encountering the very human, very flawed, very real person underneath his enlightened persona. The shadow integration that becomes possible in solitude isn't about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. It's about acknowledging that you contain the full spectrum of human experience and that your attempts to be only the good aspects of yourself actually diminish your capacity for genuine relationship and authentic contribution. When you can sit alone and acknowledge your jealousy without trying to fix it, your capacity for genuine celebration of others increases. When you can face your anger without immediately justifying or condemning it, your ability to set healthy boundaries improves. When you can recognize your selfishness without drowning in shame, your self-care becomes more authentic and therefore more sustainable. This is why Jung insisted that individuation, the process of becoming your complete authentic self, requires periods of withdrawal from social influence. You cannot clearly see your shadow while you're constantly managing your image in relationship to others. The very presence of other people activates your persona, which exists partly to hide shadow material from yourself and others. But in solitude, the persona has no purpose. Without anyone to impress or perform for, the energy you usually spend on image management becomes available for genuine self-discovery. This is when you encounter not just the pleasant aspects of your personality that you've been cultivating, but the complete range of your psychological reality. The loneliness that feels most uncomfortable is often the loneliness that's most necessary for your growth. It's not just calling you toward connection with others. It's calling you toward connection with the disowned aspects of yourself that can only be safely encountered and integrated in the privacy of your own consciousness. Shadow work isn't therapy, it's archaeology. You're excavating parts of yourself that have been buried under layers of conditioning, social expectation, and unconscious self-rejection. And like any archaeological dig, this work requires patient solitude, careful attention, and the courage to examine what you uncover without immediately trying to change it. Your shadow isn't your enemy, it's your unlived life. the aspects of your complete self that have been waiting in the wings for you to develop enough psychological maturity to welcome them home. And that welcoming can only happen in the sacred space of solitude, where no external judgment can interfere with the delicate process of becoming whole. There are seasons in the life of the soul when growth is impossible without withdrawal, when psychological transformation demands the same conditions that physical metamorphosis requires: darkness, stillness, and complete protection from external interference. Jung understood this principle intuitively, but our modern world has forgotten it entirely. We've been conditioned to believe that growth happens through constant action, continuous learning, and perpetual social engagement, when some of life's most profound transformations can only occur in the cocoon of chosen solitude. Consider the butterfly, trapped in the darkness of its chrysalis. From the outside, it appears that nothing is happening, perhaps even that something is dying. But within that protective shell, one of nature's most miraculous processes is taking place: the complete dissolution of one form of life and the emergence of something entirely new. If you were to cut open the chrysalis during this process, thinking you were helping, you would destroy the very transformation you meant to support. This is exactly what happens when we interrupt the soul's incubation periods with premature social engagement or forced productivity. We mistake the necessary darkness of psychological transformation for depression, the required stillness for stagnation, the protective isolation for social failure. Jung called these periods fallow times, seasons when the psyche needs to lie dormant, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is happening at levels too deep and delicate for external observation. Just as soil must rest between plantings to restore its nutrients, consciousness must periodically withdraw from external engagement to restore its creative and transformative capacity. The soul's incubation periods are recognizable by their quality of protective withdrawal coupled with inner activity. You find yourself naturally pulling back from social obligations, not from depression or antisocial tendencies, but from a deep instinct that something important is trying to emerge within you. Conversations that once energized you now feel draining. Activities that once brought pleasure now feel empty. People comment that you seem different, distant, changed, and they're right. This withdrawal isn't a rejection of life, but a deeper engagement with the life force itself. You're not avoiding growth. You're creating the optimal conditions for growth that couldn't happen any other way. Like the seed that must remain buried in dark soil before it can sprout, there are aspects of your authentic self that can only develop in the protected darkness of solitude. Let me tell you about Elena, an artist who experienced one of the most profound incubation periods I've witnessed. For 3 years, Elena had been creating work that garnered critical acclaim and commercial success. Her paintings were exhibited in prestigious galleries, written about in art magazines, purchased by collectors. By every external measure, her career was flourishing, but Elena was dying inside. The work that had once emerged from her soul's deepest impulses had become formulaic, created to meet market expectations rather than express authentic vision. She found herself painting what she knew would sell rather than what demanded to be painted. The creative fire that had once consumed her had been replaced by professional competence. Then something happened that changed everything. Elena lost her ability to paint, not through injury or external circumstance, but through a complete evaporation of creative impulse. She would stand before blank canvases for hours, feeling nothing. The internal well that had always provided inspiration had simply run dry. For 6 months, Elena tried everything to restore her creative flow. She took workshops, changed studios, experimented with new techniques, even underwent therapy to address what she assumed was artistic depression. Nothing worked. The harder she tried to force creativity, the more elusive it became. Finally, in desperation, Elena did something that felt like professional suicide. She stopped trying to create entirely. She cleared her studio, canceled her upcoming exhibitions, and entered what she called her creative winter, a period of complete artistic withdrawal that lasted almost 2 years. During this time, Elena didn't produce a single piece of art, but something far more important was happening. Her authentic artistic vision was being reborn. In the silence of her empty studio, away from the pressures of the art world and the expectations of her previous success, Elena began to remember why she had started painting in the first place. She spent days simply looking at light, at shadows, at the way colors changed throughout the day. She read poetry, listened to music, took long walks without any agenda except pure observation. She allowed herself to be bored, to be unproductive, to be completely disengaged from the machinery of artistic success. Gradually, images began to emerge, not as conscious creations, but as visions that seemed to arise from a source deeper than her personal imagination. These weren't the marketable paintings she'd been producing, but raw expressions of something she couldn't even name. When she finally returned to painting after nearly 2 years of withdrawal, her work had been completely transformed. The paintings Elena created after her incubation period bore little resemblance to her previous work. They were wilder, more mysterious, more authentically personal. Some critics didn't understand them. Some collectors stopped buying them. But Elena had never been more creatively alive. She had rediscovered the difference between creating art and creating products. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the necessity of psychological winters, periods when the conscious mind must surrender its agenda to allow deeper transformative processes to unfold. Elena's creative drought wasn't a problem to be solved, but a natural cycle that her psyche needed to complete its evolution from commercial artist to authentic creator. The soul's incubation periods often coincide with major life transitions, the end of relationships, career changes, spiritual awakenings, or encounters with mortality. But they can also arise spontaneously when the psyche has simply reached the limits of its current structure and needs to reorganize itself around a deeper truth. These periods are characterized by several recognizable features. First, there's a natural withdrawal from activities and relationships that once provided satisfaction. This isn't depression, it's discernment. Your psyche is protecting the delicate process of transformation by removing you from influences that might interfere with what's trying to emerge. Second, there's often a sense of emptiness or meaninglessness that can be deeply disturbing. The old sources of purpose and identity no longer work, but the new ones haven't yet emerged. This liminal space, the threshold between who you were and who you're becoming, is profoundly uncomfortable but absolutely necessary. Third, there's frequently a quality of inner stirring that's difficult to articulate. You might have strange dreams, sudden insights, or intuitive knowings that don't fit your rational understanding of yourself or your life. Something is moving in the depths, but it's too early to know what it is. Fourth, there's usually resistance from others who can't understand your withdrawal. Friends and family may interpret your need for solitude as depression, selfishness, or social rejection. They may pressure you to snap out of it, to return to your previous level of social engagement, not understanding that you're in a sacred process that has its own timing. Jung observed that our culture's inability to honor incubation periods creates enormous psychological suffering. We've been conditioned to believe that all withdrawal is pathological, that all solitude is loneliness, that all quiet periods are stagnation. We medicate natural psychological seasons, therapy eyes normal transformative processes, and socialize away the very conditions that authentic growth requires. But the psyche has its own wisdom, its own seasons. its own requirements for development. Just as you wouldn't try to force a flower to bloom in winter, you cannot force psychological transformation to happen on a schedule that serves social expectations rather than soul development. Consider James, a successful executive who entered an incubation period at the height of his corporate career. For 20 years, James had climbed the ladder with determination and skill, achieving everything he'd thought he wanted. Prestigious position, substantial income, respect from colleagues, and all the external markers of success. But something was dying inside him. The work that had once challenged and engaged him now felt mechanical. The goals that had once motivated him now seemed hollow. The identity he'd spent 2 decades building felt like an expensive suit that no longer fit. James began experiencing what he called executive emptiness, a profound sense that his life, while successful by every conventional measure, was completely meaningless. He found himself sitting in board meetings, wondering what the point of any of it was. He would drive home from the office feeling like he'd spent another day of his precious life. Force on activities that served no purpose deeper than maintaining a lifestyle he no longer enjoyed. The incubation period began when James took what was supposed to be a 2-week vacation and couldn't bring himself to return to work. Not because he was depressed or having a breakdown, but because something inside him absolutely refused to continue the performance. He took extended leave, then resigned entirely, despite having no clear plan for what would come next. For 18 months, James lived off his savings and did almost nothing that would have been recognizable as productive. He read philosophy, took long walks, sat in coffee shops watching people, traveled without itinerary or agenda. His former colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. His family worried about his future, but James was undergoing the most important transformation of his life. During this period, James discovered that beneath his executive identity lay someone he'd almost forgotten. A person deeply interested in social justice, environmental protection, and community building. These weren't new interests. They were aspects of himself that had been buried under years of corporate conditioning and financial ambition. When James finally emerged from his incubation period, he didn't return to corporate life. Instead, he founded a nonprofit organization that addressed environmental issues in underserved communities. His income dropped dramatically, but his sense of purpose and meaning increased exponentially. He had used his withdrawal period to remember not just what he was capable of doing, but what he was called to do. The soul's incubation periods serve several crucial functions that cannot be fulfilled through any other means. First, they provide necessary rest from the exhausting work of maintaining persona and managing external expectations. The constant energy required to be who others need you to be eventually depletes your authentic self. Second, they create space for the integration of life experiences that couldn't be processed during active engagement. The unconscious mind uses quiet periods to sort, categorize, and make meaning of the raw material of lived experience. Third, they allow for the emergence of new possibilities that couldn't arise while you were focused on maintaining existing structures. Innovation and transformation require empty space, psychological room for something unprecedented to emerge. Fourth, they facilitate what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to create something new from the tension between conscious and unconscious contents. This process cannot happen while you're actively engaged with external demands and stimulation. The length and intensity of incubation periods vary enormously. Some last weeks, others years. Some involve complete withdrawal from normal activities, others simply a pulling back of emotional investment in external affairs. The key is learning to recognize when you're entering such a period and to honor its requirements rather than fighting against them. Our culture's addiction to constant productivity and growth makes these periods extremely challenging to navigate. You'll be pressured to get back out there, to not waste your talents, to stay connected. Well-meaning friends and family will offer solutions, opportunities, and interventions designed to end your withdrawal and return you to your previous level of engagement. But if you're truly in a soul incubation period, these interventions will feel wrong, even when they're objectively good opportunities. Your psyche knows that premature emergence from the chrysalis will abort the transformation process. The butterfly must complete its metamorphosis in darkness before it can fly in the light. This doesn't mean that all withdrawal is healthy or that all solitude serves growth. There's a crucial difference between the protective withdrawal of incubation and the defensive withdrawal of avoidance. Incubation feels like being called inward toward something important. Avoidance feels like being pushed away from everything meaningful. Healthy incubation is characterized by inner activity, even when external activity ceases. You may not be producing anything visible, but you're processing, integrating, and preparing. Unhealthy withdrawal is characterized by inner deadness, disconnection not just from others, but from your own life force. The challenge is learning to trust the wisdom of your own psychological seasons, even when they don't make sense to others or even to your rational mind. Your soul knows when it needs to withdraw, just as your body knows when it needs sleep. Fighting against these natural rhythms creates suffering and delays the very transformation that the withdrawal is meant to facilitate. Jung spent much of his later life helping people distinguish between pathological isolation and sacred solitude, between depression and incubation, between avoidance and necessary withdrawal. He understood that some of the most important work of human development happens not through action, but through patient waiting, not through engagement, but through protective disengagement. If you're currently experiencing a pull toward withdrawal, if social obligations feel draining rather than nourishing, if you're being called toward solitude despite others' concerns, consider the possibility that you're entering an incubation period. Instead of fighting this impulse or allowing others to pathologize it, ask yourself, what might be trying to be born within me that requires this particular kind of protection and stillness? Your loneliness during these periods isn't evidence that something is wrong. It's evidence that something profound is happening at levels deeper than social connection can reach. You're not avoiding life. You're preparing for a more authentic way of living it. You're not giving up on growth. You're creating the optimal conditions for the kind of growth that can only happen in the sacred darkness of solitude. The butterfly doesn't apologize for its time in the chrysalis. It doesn't rush the process or cut short its transformation to ease others' concerns about its withdrawal. It trusts the wisdom of its own metamorphosis, knowing that the darkness is temporary, but the transformation will be permanent. Your soul has the same wisdom. It knows when withdrawal serves growth and when emergence serves expression. Learning to trust this wisdom, even when it conflicts with social expectations or rational planning, is one of the most important skills you can develop in navigating the authentic life. The incubation period isn't a detour from your real life. It is your real life, in one of its most important phases, and like all sacred processes, it has its own timing, its own requirements, and its own ultimate purpose, the birth of who you really are, freed from the limitations of who you thought you had to be. Deep within the process, Jung called individuation, the psychological journey toward becoming your authentic, complete self, lies a paradox that most people never understand. You can only discover who you truly are by learning to be genuinely alone with who you are right now. Individuation isn't just about personal growth or self-improvement. It's about the sacred work of differentiating your authentic self from the collective programming, family patterns, and social conditioning that have shaped your identity since birth. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is being who you are." But what he didn't explicitly say is that becoming who you are requires periods of such complete solitude that all external voices fall silent, leaving space for your authentic voice to emerge from the depths of your unconscious mind. The individuation process cannot happen while you're constantly receiving input about who you should be, what you should want, or how you should live. It requires what Jung called a withdrawal of projections, a process by which you stop seeing yourself through other people's eyes and begin to discover yourself through your own inner knowing. This is why every authentic spiritual tradition includes periods of solitude, retreat, and withdrawal from ordinary social life. The hermit's cave, the monk's cell, the artist's studio, the philosopher's study, all are recognition that individual consciousness can only fully develop when temporarily protected from collective influence. But our modern world has forgotten this ancient wisdom. We've been conditioned to believe that identity comes from social feedback, that self-knowledge comes from external reflection, that personal value comes from others' recognition of our worth. The result is a culture of people who know how to be who others want them to be, but have lost all contact with who they actually are. Consider the 4 stages of individuation as Jung understood them, and notice how each stage requires a different relationship with solitude. Stage 1. The call to individuation. This often begins with what Jung called the breakdown of the persona, a growing awareness that the socially adapted version of yourself is not your complete self. You begin to feel restless, empty, or unfulfilled despite external success. There's a sense that you're living someone else's life or performing someone else's version of who you should be. The call to individuation frequently manifests as a sudden need for solitude that you can't explain rationally. You find yourself pulling back from social obligations, losing interest in activities that once seemed important, or feeling drained by interactions that used to energize you. This isn't depression, it's discernment. Your psyche is beginning to distinguish between what authentically serves your development and what merely serves your social adaptation. Stage 2. The encounter with the shadow. As we explored in the previous chapter, the shadow work that's essential to individuation can only happen in solitude. You must face the aspects of yourself that you've been projecting onto others, denying or trying to overcome. This work requires privacy because it involves acknowledging thoughts, feelings, and impulses that don't fit your conscious self-image. The shadow encounter often intensifies your need for alone time because you're processing psychological material that can't be shared or discussed until you've first acknowledged it to yourself. You're not hiding from others. You're creating space to meet yourself fully before attempting to relate authentically with anyone else. Stage 3. The integration of the anima animus. Jung identified the anima, the feminine aspect in men, and animus, the masculine aspect in women, as crucial elements of the complete self that must be consciously integrated for individuation to occur. This integration requires extended periods of inner dialogue, active imagination, and receptive listening to aspects of your psyche that speak in a different voice from your ordinary consciousness. This stage often involves a profound rebalancing of your personality, developing qualities that were previously unconscious or underdeveloped. A highly rational person might discover their intuitive capacity. An intensely emotional person might develop their thinking function. This rebalancing requires solitude because it involves temporary psychological instability as old patterns dissolve and new ones emerge. Stage 4. The realization of the self. The final stage involves what Jung called the realization of the self. Not the ego self, but the archetypal self that represents your complete psychological potential. This isn't a permanent achievement, but an ongoing process of aligning your conscious choices with your deepest authentic nature. At this stage, solitude becomes not an escape from relationship, but a source of strength that makes authentic relationship possible. You've developed enough inner stability to remain yourself regardless of external circumstances. You can be fully present with others because you're fully present with yourself. Let me share the story of Catherine, whose individuation journey illustrates how this process actually unfolds in a real life. Catherine was a successful therapist, mother, and wife who appeared to have everything together. She was known for her wisdom, compassion, and ability to help others navigate their psychological challenges. Everyone who knew her saw her as remarkably mature and self-aware. But Catherine was harboring a secret. She had no idea who she was when she wasn't helping someone else. Her entire identity was built around being useful to other people. She couldn't make decisions without considering how they would affect others. She couldn't enjoy activities unless they served some larger purpose. She couldn't even sit quietly without feeling like she should be doing something productive. The call to individuation came when Catherine's last child left for college, leaving her with what she initially thought was empty nest syndrome, but gradually recognized as something much deeper. She had never developed an identity independent of her roles as helper, mother, and wife. For the first time in 30 years, Catherine had time and space that belonged entirely to her, and she had no idea what to do with either. The prospect of unstructured time filled her with anxiety because she'd never learned to exist without external demands organizing her day and validating her worth. Against her family's concerns and her own fears, Catherine decided to take a sabbatical from her therapy practice and spend 6 months discovering who she was when she wasn't taking care of anyone else. This decision felt simultaneously selfish and necessary. Selfish because it seemed to prioritize her own needs over others. Necessary because she was beginning to recognize that she had needs that had been completely neglected. The first month of Catherine's sabbatical was agony. Without clients to help and family members to care for, she felt completely purposeless. She tried to fill the time with self-improvement activities, yoga classes, meditation retreats, educational workshops, but even these felt empty because they weren't serving anyone but herself. Gradually, Catherine began to discover something she'd never known existed. Her own preferences, interests, and desires that had nothing to do with being useful to others. She found herself drawn to pottery, not because it would help anyone, but because the feel of clay in her hands brought her inexplicable joy. She started reading mystery novels, not for any therapeutic or educational value, but simply because they entertained her. Most surprisingly, Catherine discovered that she had opinions, strong opinions, about things that had nothing to do with psychology or helping others. She had always been so focused on understanding others' perspectives that she'd never developed her own viewpoint on art, politics, spirituality, or even simple matters of taste and preference. As Catherine continued her solitary exploration, she began to understand why this process had been so terrifying to consider. She wasn't just discovering who she was discovering that who she was didn't match who she'd been pretending to be, even to herself. The Catherine who emerged from 6 months of solitude was both the same person and completely different. She returned to her therapy practice, but with clearer boundaries and a stronger sense of what kinds of clients and issues truly engaged her rather than just needed her help. She resumed her family relationships, but as someone with her own needs and interests, rather than someone who existed primarily to serve others' needs. Most importantly, Catherine had developed what Jung considered essential for psychological maturity: the capacity to be completely comfortable in her own company. She no longer needed external validation to feel worthwhile or external demands to feel purposeful. She had discovered the difference between being alone and being lonely, between serving others from authentic compassion and serving others from unconscious compulsion. This transformation is what Jung meant by individuation, not becoming perfect or achieving some ideal state, but becoming genuinely yourself rather than a compilation of others' expectations and your own unconscious adaptations to those expectations. The individuation process requires solitude because it involves distinguishing between your authentic responses and your conditioned responses. When you're constantly interacting with others, you automatically slip into familiar relational patterns. Your persona activates, your people-pleasing mechanisms engage, your unconscious desire to be liked and accepted influences every choice. But in sustained solitude, not the entertainment-filled kind of alone time, but genuine engagement with your own consciousness, these automatic patterns begin to fade. Without anyone to impress, please, or perform for, you begin to discover what you actually think, feel, want, and value. This discovery process is often uncomfortable because it reveals the extent to which your public identity differs from your private reality. You might discover that you're more introverted than you've been pretending to be, more ambitious than you've been comfortable admitting, more creative than you've had time to express, or more spiritual than your rational mind has been willing to acknowledge. The individuation journey also reveals what Jung called unlived life, all the aspects of your potential that have been suppressed in service of social adaptation. The artist within the accountant, the mystic within the scientist, the adventurer within the responsible citizen. These aren't new personalities you need to develop. They're authentic aspects of yourself that have been waiting for permission to emerge. Solitude provides that permission by removing all the external pressures that keep these aspects hidden. In the privacy of your own consciousness, you can safely explore interests, thoughts, and feelings that don't fit your established identity without immediately having to explain or justify them to others. This is why individuation can be threatening to relationships that are based on your previous identity. Family members, friends, and partners who are invested in you remaining who they've always known you to be may resist your individual development. They may interpret your need for solitude as rejection, your changing interests as instability, or your growing authenticity as selfishness. Jung understood that this resistance is partly why individuation requires courage, not just the courage to face your own depths, but the courage to risk relationships that cannot accommodate your authentic self. Not all relationships survive the individuation process, and this is both painful and necessary. But Jung also observed that relationships that do survive individuation become deeper and more genuine because they're based on authentic connection rather than mutual persona maintenance. When you show up as your real self, you attract and maintain relationships with people who actually like who you are rather than who you've been pretending to be. The goal of individuation isn't to become antisocial or to avoid relationships. It's to develop enough inner stability and self-knowledge that you can engage with others from authenticity rather than need, from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than deficiency. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the individuated person as someone who could be genuinely alone without being lonely and genuinely connected without losing themselves. They've developed what he called inner marriage, an integrated relationship between all aspects of their personality that makes them complete within themselves, while remaining open to authentic connection with others. The individuated person doesn't need others to feel whole, but they choose to be with others because relationship serves their continued growth and allows them to express their authentic self. They're not afraid of solitude because they've discovered it as a source of renewal and self-knowledge. They're not afraid of intimacy because they have something authentic to share. If you're feeling called toward periods of solitude that others don't understand, if you're questioning aspects of your identity that have seemed stable for years, if you're losing interest in relationships and activities that once seemed important, you may be receiving the call to individuation. This call rarely comes at convenient times or in comfortable circumstances. It often coincides with life crises, transitions, or periods when your established identity is no longer adequate for the life you're being called to live. The timing isn't accidental. The individuation process requires enough disruption to break through the inertia of unconscious living. Your response to this call will determine whether you remain a collection of others' expectations or become the unique individual you were meant to be. The choice isn't between solitude and relationship. It's between unconscious conformity and conscious authenticity. Individuation doesn't end. It's not a destination, but a way of living that honors both your need for genuine solitude and your capacity for authentic connection. It's a lifelong practice of choosing who you are rather than accepting who you've been told to be. And it begins, as Jung knew, with the courage to be genuinely alone with yourself, not as escape from others, but as the foundation for meeting them as your authentic self, rather than as another performance of who you think they need you to be. There's a layer of reality that Jung discovered which explains why some people experience profound loneliness, not as personal inadequacy, but as psychic necessity, the collective unconscious. This isn't the personal unconscious filled with your own forgotten memories and repressed experiences. It's the deeper stratum of unconscious content that you share with all humanity, and for individuals with heightened sensitivity to this collective layer, periods of solitude aren't just beneficial, they're essential for psychological survival. Jung realized that certain individuals function as psychological barometers, unconsciously absorbing the anxieties, conflicts, and shadow material of the collective human psyche. These people, often highly creative, intuitive, or spiritually sensitive individuals, experience the world not just through their personal psychological filters, but through a heightened awareness of the collective emotional and psychic atmosphere. When such individuals feel overwhelmed by loneliness, they're often experiencing something far more complex than personal isolation. They're being called to withdraw from collective consciousness because their psyche recognizes that continued exposure to mass mental and emotional content will interfere with their individual development and authentic expression. This is a controversial idea in our hyper-connected age, but Jung observed it consistently in his most creative and spiritually gifted patients. They needed regular periods of complete isolation, not because they were antisocial, but because they were unconsciously processing collective material that others either couldn't perceive or naturally filtered out. Consider the current state of collective consciousness. We're living through a period of unprecedented global communication where individual minds are constantly bombarded with the fears, opinions, traumas, and conflicts of millions of other people. Through social media, news cycles, and digital connectivity, we're exposed to more collective psychic material in a single day than previous generations encountered in years. For psychologically sensitive individuals, this constant input isn't just overwhelming, it's psychically toxic. They find themselves absorbing others' anxieties, taking on collective fears as personal problems, and losing contact with their authentic thoughts and feelings in the midst of the psychic noise. Let me tell you about Thomas, a writer whose creative gifts came with an unusual burden. He could sense the collective emotional atmosphere with the sensitivity of a seismograph detecting earthquake tremors. When collective anxiety was high, during economic uncertainty, political conflicts, or social upheaval, Thomas would find himself paralyzed by fears and worries that weren't based on his personal circumstances. For years, Thomas thought he was simply neurotic or overly sensitive. He tried various therapies and medications to reduce what seemed like irrational anxiety, but nothing helped because the anxiety wasn't personal, it was collective. He was unconsciously absorbing and processing the fears and conflicts of the broader human community. The breakthrough came when Thomas recognized that his periods of intense loneliness and social withdrawal corresponded exactly to periods of collective crisis and upheaval. During calm social periods, he could function normally in relationships and social situations. But during times of collective stress, he would become overwhelmed by a need for solitude so intense that it felt like a matter of psychological life and death. Once Thomas understood this pattern, he stopped trying to force himself into social engagement during his withdrawal periods and instead began to honor them as necessary protection. He learned to recognize the difference between his authentic emotions and the collective emotional content he was unconsciously processing. During his solitary periods, Thomas would engage in what Jung called active imagination, consciously dialoguing with the collective material he was absorbing rather than being unconsciously overwhelmed by it. He would write, paint, or simply sit in contemplation, allowing the collective fears and conflicts to move through his consciousness without making them personal. This practice transformed Thomas's relationship with both solitude and collective engagement. His withdrawal periods became creative and spiritually productive rather than isolating and anxious. When he did re-engage socially, he could participate in collective life without losing himself in collective consciousness. Most importantly, Thomas discovered that his sensitivity to collective material wasn't a burden to be overcome, but a gift to be developed. His writing began to address themes and concerns that resonated with many people because he was unconsciously processing material that was affecting the broader human community. His loneliness had been protecting not just his individual development, but his capacity to serve collective healing through authentic creative expression. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of certain individuals serving as carriers of collective compensation. They unconsciously absorb and process psychological material that the collective has been unable to consciously integrate. Their periods of withdrawal and apparent isolation are actually periods of deep service to human consciousness. But this service can only occur when these individuals learn to distinguish between personal and collective psychological content. Without this discrimination, they simply become overwhelmed by material that isn't theirs to process or integrate. Jung identified several characteristics of people who are particularly susceptible to collective influence and therefore need regular periods of protective solitude, high empathic sensitivity. These individuals naturally absorb others' emotional states without conscious intention. In groups, they unconsciously take on the role of emotional regulator, sensing and responding to others' unspoken feelings. This capacity makes them valuable friends and healers, but also vulnerable to psychic overwhelm. Creative and artistic temperament. Artists, writers, musicians, and other creative individuals often have naturally permeable boundaries between conscious and unconscious material. This openness makes them excellent channels for creative inspiration, but also vulnerable to absorbing collective psychological content that can interfere with authentic expression. Spiritual or mystical inclinations. People drawn to spiritual practices often develop heightened sensitivity to subtle energies and unconscious material. While this sensitivity supports spiritual development, it also requires careful management to prevent psychic overwhelm. Introverted nature. Jung observed that introverts naturally process information more deeply and thoroughly than extroverts. When introverted individuals are exposed to high levels of social stimulation, they don't just become tired, they become psychically saturated with others' psychological material. History of trauma or early sensitivity. Individuals who developed heightened vigilance due to early trauma or who were naturally sensitive children often maintain this hypervigilance into adulthood. While this can be protective, it also makes them vulnerable to absorbing environmental psychological content. If you recognize yourself in these descriptions, your periods of loneliness may not be personal isolation but psychic self-protection. Your soul recognizes that continued exposure to collective consciousness will interfere with your individual development and authentic expression. The solution isn't to become permanently antisocial, but to develop what Jung called conscious relationship with the collective. This involves learning to distinguish between your authentic psychological content and the collective material you're unconsciously absorbing. Protective practices for collective sensitivity, energy discrimination. Learn to notice when your emotional state shifts in response to environments, media consumption, or social contact. Practice asking, is this feeling mine or am I absorbing it from someone else? Conscious boundaries. Develop rituals for psychic protection before entering highly stimulating environments. This might involve meditation, visualization, or simply conscious intention to maintain your energetic boundaries. Regular clearing practices. Engage in activities that help you process and release absorbed collective material. This might include journaling, creative expression, physical exercise, or spending time in nature. Media hygiene. Recognize that consuming news, social media, and entertainment involves exposure to collective psychological material. Limit your consumption during vulnerable periods and choose content consciously rather than passively absorbing whatever algorithms provide. Sacred solitude practices. Develop regular practices for genuine solitude, time spent without any external input, where you can reconnect with your authentic self and distinguish it from absorbed collective content. Consider Sarah, a therapist who worked with trauma patients and found herself increasingly overwhelmed by collective suffering. She loved her work and felt called to help others heal, but she was unconsciously absorbing not just her client's pain, but the broader collective trauma of human suffering. Sarah's breaking point came during a period of intense global upheaval when she found herself unable to sleep, eat, or function normally, despite the fact that her personal life was stable and fulfilling. She realized that she wasn't just experiencing her client's trauma, she was processing collective human trauma at a level that was beyond her individual capacity to integrate. Working with a Jungian analyst, Sarah learned to recognize when she was absorbing collective material and developed practices for processing it consciously rather than being overwhelmed by it. She created clear boundaries between her therapeutic work and her personal life. She limited her exposure to traumatic content outside of her professional practice. Most importantly, she honored her need for regular solitude to process and release the collective material she encountered. These practices didn't make Sarah less effective as a therapist. They made her more effective because she could work with clients' pain without taking it on as her own. She could be present to collective suffering without being destroyed by it. This is the paradox of collective sensitivity. Those who are most naturally equipped to serve collective healing are also most vulnerable to collective overwhelm. The solution isn't to eliminate their sensitivity, but to develop conscious practices for managing it. Jung understood that collective consciousness includes not just shared cultural values and beliefs, but also shared unconscious material, the collective shadow of unprocessed trauma, denied impulses, and rejected aspects of human nature. Sensitive individuals often absorb this shadow material and experience it as depression, anxiety, or inexplicable negative emotions. During historical periods of collective crisis, wars, economic collapse, social upheaval, sensitive individuals may experience intensified loneliness and withdrawal, not because of personal problems, but because they're unconsciously processing collective shadow material. Their withdrawal serves both individual protection and collective function as they process in solitude what the collective cannot yet consciously acknowledge. This understanding reframes loneliness from personal inadequacy to potential collective service. Your withdrawal from social engagement during certain periods may not be personal failure but unconscious wisdom. Your psyche protecting both your individual development and your capacity to serve collective healing. Jung believed that individuals with heightened collective sensitivity often serve as what he called cultural canaries in the coal mine. They feel the psychological toxicity of collective consciousness before it becomes apparent to the broader population. Their withdrawal and apparent isolation may actually be early warning systems for collective psychological crisis. This doesn't mean that all loneliness is collective sensitivity or that all withdrawal serves collective function. But for individuals with naturally permeable psychological boundaries, understanding this possibility can transform their relationship with solitude from shame to sacred responsibility. Your loneliness may be your soul's way of saying, the collective atmosphere is too toxic for your individual development right now. You need to withdraw and reconnect with your authentic self before you can engage with others from a place of strength, rather than unconscious absorption. Learning to honor this wisdom, even when others don't understand it, is essential for maintaining both psychological health and authentic contribution to collective healing. Your solitude isn't escape from responsibility, it's preparation for more conscious and effective engagement with the human community. The goal isn't to become permanently isolated from collective consciousness, but to develop what Jung called conscious participation, the ability to engage with collective life without losing yourself in collective possession. This requires regular periods of withdrawal for processing, integration, and reconnection with your individual center. In our globally connected age, this capacity for conscious collective engagement has never been more important. Those who cannot distinguish between personal and collective psychological content become unconscious carriers of collective shadow material, spreading anxiety, conflict, and trauma without realizing it. But those who learn to process collective material consciously become what Jung called culture bearers, individuals who can participate in collective life while maintaining connection to deeper sources of wisdom and healing that serve the evolution of human consciousness. Your loneliness may be preparing you for this more conscious form of collective participation. Instead of seeing it as isolation from others, consider it as preparation for more authentic and effective engagement with the human community you're ultimately called to serve. There exists a fundamental distinction that most people never learn to recognize, a distinction so important that understanding it can transform your entire relationship with solitude and connection. It's the difference between loneliness, which is disconnection from your authentic self, and sacred solitude, which is deeper connection with your authentic self in the absence of others. Loneliness is what you experience when you're cut off from your own life force, when you feel isolated not just from other people, but from your own sense of meaning, purpose, and vitality. It's characterized by emptiness, despair, and the sense that something essential is missing from your experience. Sacred solitude, on the other hand, is what you experience when you're so connected to your own inner reality that the presence or absence of other people becomes secondary to the richness of your internal experience. It's characterized by fullness, peace, and the sense that everything essential is available within your own consciousness. The tragedy of our culture is that most people have never experienced genuine sacred solitude, so they assume that all aloneness is loneliness. They've been so conditioned to seek external validation and stimulation that they've lost contact with the profound satisfaction that comes from being genuinely present with your own consciousness. Jung understood this distinction intuitively. He spent much of his later life cultivating what he called the art of being alone, not as escape from relationship, but as the foundation for all authentic relationship. He recognized that people who cannot be happily alone cannot be genuinely present with others, because they bring the needy, grasping energy of someone trying to fill an internal void through external connection. Let me tell you about Michael, a man who discovered this distinction in the most unexpected way. Michael was a successful social worker who had dedicated his life to helping others, but he harbored a secret: shame. He was terrified of being alone. His apartment was always filled with friends, colleagues, or romantic partners. His schedule was packed with social obligations, volunteer work, and professional commitments. He literally could not remember the last time he had spent an entire evening by himself. Michael's terror of solitude ran so deep that he would drive to 24-hour coffee shops just to be around other people when he couldn't sleep. He would accept social invitations to events he had no interest in attending just to avoid spending time alone. He would maintain relationships that drained his energy because the alternative, being alone, seemed even worse. Then life intervened in a way that forced Michael to confront his deepest fear. A combination of circumstances, illness, job loss, and the end of a long-term relationship left him isolated, unemployed, and unable to maintain his usual frantic pace of social engagement. For the first time in his adult life, Michael was forced to be genuinely alone with himself for extended periods. The initial experience was exactly as terrifying as he had anticipated. Without external stimulation and social validation, Michael felt like he was dissolving. He experienced panic attacks, insomnia, and a sense of existential meaninglessness that made him question whether life was worth living. But something extraordinary happened as Michael persisted through this dark period instead of immediately seeking distraction or escape. After weeks of sitting with his terror of aloneness, he began to discover something he had never known existed: the difference between being alone and being lonely. The breakthrough came during a simple moment when Michael was sitting in his kitchen, drinking coffee and watching sunlight move across his table. For the first time in months, he wasn't trying to fix his situation, plan his future, or distract himself from his circumstances. He was simply present with what was happening in that moment. In that simple presence, Michael experienced something he had never felt before: complete contentment with his own company. Not happiness exactly, but a deep sense of okayness that didn't depend on anything external. He realized that what he had been calling loneliness was actually anxiety about being alone, not the experience of authentic solitude itself. Over the following months, Michael discovered that genuine solitude was not empty but incredibly rich. When he stopped trying to escape from his own consciousness, he found that it was full of interesting thoughts, creative impulses, and insights that had been drowned out by constant social stimulation. He began to distinguish between the different qualities of aloneness he experienced. Sometimes he felt lonely, disconnected from himself and others, empty and desperately craving external connection. But increasingly, he experienced what he came to call sacred solitude, a quality of aloneness that felt full, peaceful, and deeply nourishing. In sacred solitude, Michael wasn't trying to fill time or escape from difficult feelings. He was simply present with whatever arose in his consciousness, allowing thoughts and emotions to move through his awareness without immediately needing to share them with someone else or seek validation for them. This capacity for sacred solitude transformed Michael's relationships in ways he never could have anticipated. When he eventually resumed social contact, he found that he was drawn to very different types of interactions. He was no longer interested in superficial socializing or relationships based on mutual neediness. He wanted connections with people who could also be comfortable with silence, with depth, with the kind of presence that emerges from inner fullness rather than inner emptiness. Most surprisingly, Michael discovered that his capacity for solitude made him more attractive to others, not less. People were drawn to his centered presence, his lack of desperate need for their approval, and his ability to be genuinely present without agenda or expectation. This is the paradox that Jung understood. The more comfortable you become with your own company, the more genuinely connected you become with others. When you're not trying to fill an internal void through external relationships, you can meet people from fullness rather than neediness, from curiosity rather than compulsion, from choice rather than desperation. Sacred solitude has several distinctive characteristics that differentiate it from loneliness. Inner activity rather than emptiness. In sacred solitude, your inner world becomes active and engaging. You find yourself naturally contemplating, creating, or simply observing the contents of your own consciousness with interest rather than judgment. Presence rather than avoidance. Sacred solitude involves being fully present with your current experience rather than trying to escape from it. You're not using aloneness to avoid difficult feelings, but to be more intimately present with all aspects of your inner life. Fullness rather than emptiness. Instead of feeling empty or lacking, sacred solitude often involves a sense of inner fullness or completeness. You feel resourced from within rather than depleted by the absence of external stimulation. Choice rather than circumstance. Sacred solitude is something you choose rather than something that happens to you. Even when circumstances force you into aloneness, you can transform it into sacred solitude by changing your relationship to the experience. Connection rather than disconnection. Paradoxically, sacred solitude often involves feeling more connected to yourself, to nature, to the deeper currents of life, rather than disconnected from everything meaningful. Renewal rather than depletion. Time spent in sacred solitude leaves you feeling renewed and resourced rather than drained or depressed. You emerge from it with more energy for authentic engagement with others, rather than less. The cultivation of sacred solitude is both an art and a practice. It requires learning to be present with your own consciousness without immediately reaching for external stimulation or distraction. It involves developing what Jung called active imagination, the ability to engage consciously with the contents of your unconscious mind. Here's how to begin cultivating sacred solitude in your own life. Start small. Begin with short periods of genuine aloneness, perhaps 30 minutes without any external input, no phone, no entertainment, no tasks. Simply sit and observe what emerges in your consciousness when it's not being directed by external stimulation. Notice the difference. Pay attention to the qualitative difference between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness feels like being cut off from life. Solitude feels like being more intimately connected to life. Practice presence. Instead of trying to fill alone time with activities, practice simply being present with whatever arises. This might include difficult emotions, creative impulses, random thoughts, or simple awareness of your immediate environment. Cultivate inner dialogue. Learn to have conscious conversations with different aspects of your psyche. You might dialogue with your fears, your creative impulses, or your deeper wisdom. This isn't about becoming multiple personalities, but about recognizing the different voices within your complete self. Create sacred space. Designate specific places and times for solitude practice. This might be a corner of your home, a place in nature, or simply a regular time when you commit to being genuinely alone with yourself. Develop solitude rituals. Create simple rituals that mark the transition into sacred solitude. This might involve lighting a candle, making tea, or simply taking 3 conscious breaths to center yourself in your own presence. Consider the story of Maria, a busy executive who initially viewed her commute time as dead time, to be filled with podcasts, phone calls, or productivity tasks. When her car broke down and she was forced to take public transportation for several weeks, Maria decided to experiment with using her commute time for solitude practice instead of filling it with input. Initially, sitting quietly on the bus or train felt uncomfortable and boring, but gradually Maria began to appreciate this time as the only part of her day when she wasn't expected to be productive, responsive, or engaged with others' needs. She found herself naturally reflecting on her life, processing the events of her day, and simply observing the world around her with curiosity rather than judgment. This daily solitude practice began to transform Maria's entire life. She found herself less reactive to workplace stress because she had regular time to process and integrate her experiences. She became more creative in her problem solving because she gave her mind space to wander and make unexpected connections. Most importantly, she developed a relationship with her own consciousness that made all her other relationships more authentic and less needy. When Maria's car was repaired, she chose to continue taking public transportation several days a week, specifically to maintain her solitude practice. She had discovered that this time alone wasn't time lost, but time gained. Time for the kind of inner connection that made all her outer connections more meaningful. The cultivation of sacred solitude is particularly challenging in our current cultural moment because we've been conditioned to view any unoccupied moment as a problem to be solved. We reach for our phones the instant we feel the first stirring of boredom or discomfort. We fill every silence with sound, every empty moment with activity, every period of potential solitude with external stimulation. But Jung understood that the capacity for genuine solitude is essential for psychological maturity. He observed that people who cannot be alone without feeling lonely remain psychologically dependent on others for their sense of identity, worth, and meaning. They cannot offer authentic presence to others because they haven't learned to be authentically present with themselves. Sacred solitude isn't about becoming antisocial or avoiding relationships. It's about developing enough inner stability and self-connection that your relationships are based on choice rather than need, on authentic sharing rather than mutual filling of internal voids. When you've cultivated genuine comfort with solitude, your social interactions become more selective and more satisfying. You're drawn to people who can also be comfortable with silence, with depth, with the kind of presence that emerges from inner fullness rather than inner emptiness. You stop trying to use relationships to escape from yourself and start using them to express yourself more fully. You stop seeking validation from others and start offering authentic appreciation. You stop performing to be liked and start being genuinely yourself. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation leading to more authentic relationship rather than less. The person who has learned to be genuinely alone has something real to offer in connection. They bring presence rather than need, fullness rather than emptiness, choice rather than compulsion. Your journey towards sacred solitude isn't about rejecting human connection, but about preparing yourself for connection that nourishes your soul rather than depleting it. And that preparation begins with the radical act of learning to enjoy your own company, not as consolation for the absence of others, but as the foundation for all meaningful relationship. There comes a time in many people's spiritual development when they experience a form of loneliness so profound that it seems to threaten their very existence. This isn't ordinary social isolation or even the loneliness of personal rejection. It's what mystics have called the dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual emptiness and divine silence that feels like abandonment by everything sacred and meaningful. Jung encountered this phenomenon repeatedly in his analytical practice, and he lived through his own dark night during his confrontation with the unconscious in the years following his break with Freud. He recognized that this spiritual loneliness wasn't pathological but developmental, a necessary passage that occurs when consciousness outgrows its previous relationship with meaning and must undergo death and rebirth at a deeper level. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The dark night of the soul is the period when all imagined figures of light disappear, leaving you alone with a darkness so complete that you must either surrender to it or be destroyed by your resistance to it. This spiritual loneliness is different from other forms of isolation because it occurs at the level of meaning itself. You don't just feel disconnected from other people, you feel disconnected from your own sense of purpose, from your relationship with the sacred, from your understanding of why existence matters at all. During the dark night, prayers feel like words spoken into empty space. Spiritual practices that once brought comfort and connection now feel mechanical and meaningless. The beliefs, teachers, and communities that once provided guidance and support may feel irrelevant or even false. You're left completely alone with the most fundamental questions of existence. Who am I? Why am I here? What is the point of any of this? Let me tell you about David, a meditation teacher who had spent 15 years developing what he thought was a solid spiritual foundation. David had a regular meditation practice, led retreats, had studied with respected teachers, and was known in his community as someone who had achieved unusual spiritual maturity and peace. Then something happened that shattered David's entire spiritual worldview. His 8-year-old daughter was diagnosed with terminal cancer. David approached his daughter's illness the way he approached everything, through spiritual practice. He meditated more intensely, sought guidance from his teachers, prayed for healing, and tried to maintain the equanimity that had become his trademark. But as his daughter's condition worsened, despite all spiritual interventions, David's faith began to collapse. The meditation that had once brought peace now brought only agitation. The spiritual concepts that had once provided meaning now felt like empty platitudes in the face of senseless suffering. The teachers whose wisdom he had trusted seemed to have nothing to offer when faced with real tragedy. Most devastating of all, David began to experience what felt like silence from the divine presence that had been the center of his spiritual life. His prayers seemed to disappear into void. His connection to what he had called God, universe, or higher power felt completely severed. During the months of his daughter's treatment and eventual death, David experienced a loneliness so complete that it made his previous understanding of isolation seem trivial. He wasn't just alone with his grief. He was alone with the fundamental meaninglessness that seemed to underlie all existence. This is the essence of the dark night. You're not just experiencing difficult circumstances, you're experiencing the collapse of the meaning-making systems that previously helped you navigate difficult circumstances. The spiritual resources you've relied on feel absent or inadequate. The sense of connection to something larger than yourself disappears completely. For David, this period lasted almost 2 years. He stopped teaching meditation, abandoned his spiritual practices, and isolated himself from the spiritual community that had been his primary source of identity and belonging. He couldn't pretend to have answers when he was drowning in questions. He couldn't offer guidance when he felt completely lost. But something remarkable happened in the depths of David's spiritual loneliness. He began to discover a relationship with the sacred that was far more authentic than anything he had experienced during his years of spiritual seeking. Stripped of all his concepts, practices, and beliefs about what spirituality should look like, David encountered something raw and real that didn't depend on his understanding or acceptance. In his complete abandonment, David found himself held by something he couldn't name or explain. Not the anthropomorphic God of his childhood religion, not the cosmic consciousness of his meditation practice, but something far more mysterious and intimate that seemed to embrace even his doubt, rage, and despair. This is what Jung meant when he described the dark night as a necessary phase of spiritual development. It's the period when your ego's relationship with the sacred must die so that a more authentic spiritual connection can be born. The loneliness you experience isn't abandonment by the divine. It's the space between one form of spiritual understanding and another, more mature relationship with mystery. Jung identified several characteristics of authentic dark night experiences: meaninglessness rather than depression. While the dark night can include depressive symptoms, it's primarily characterized by a profound sense that nothing matters, that existence itself is without purpose or direction. Spiritual dryness rather than emotional numbness. You don't stop feeling. If anything, you may feel more intensely, but your spiritual practices, beliefs, and sources of meaning feel completely empty and ineffective. Divine silence rather than divine absence. The sacred doesn't disappear during the dark night. It becomes completely silent. You may still sense its presence, but it no longer communicates in ways your conscious mind can recognize or understand. Existential questioning rather than personal problems. The dark night involves questioning the fundamental nature of reality, meaning, and existence, rather than just dealing with personal difficulties or life circumstances. Involuntary rather than chosen. Unlike periods of intentional spiritual discipline or retreat, the dark night happens to you. You cannot control its timing, intensity, or duration through spiritual practice or effort. Jung understood that the dark night serves several essential functions in psychological and spiritual development: ego death and rebirth. Your ego's identification with particular spiritual beliefs, practices, or experiences must dissolve before a more authentic relationship with the sacred can emerge. Purification of spiritual materialism. The dark night burns away any unconscious ways you've been using spirituality to enhance your ego or avoid difficult aspects of human existence. Development of genuine faith. True faith isn't belief in particular concepts, but the capacity to remain open to mystery, even when you cannot understand or control it. Integration of shadow material. The dark night often involves encountering spiritual pride, doubt, rage, and despair that you've been unconsciously avoiding through spiritual practice. Preparation for service. Many people emerge from dark night experiences with a deeper capacity to help others who are suffering because they've learned to find meaning in meaninglessness. The challenge of navigating the dark night is that none of your previous spiritual resources seem to help. The practices that once brought comfort now feel empty. The teachers whose guidance you valued no longer seem relevant to your experience. The communities that provided support may not understand what you're going through. This isolation is both the agony and the necessity of the dark night. You must face the fundamental questions of existence without the comfort of ready-made answers. You must encounter mystery without the protection of belief systems. You must find meaning without the support of external spiritual authorities. Jung observed that people often try to end the dark night prematurely by returning to old spiritual patterns, seeking new teachers or practices, or trying to think their way out of the experience. But these attempts usually fail because the dark night isn't a problem to be solved. It's a process to be completed. Consider the story of Sarah, a woman who had built her identity around being spiritually evolved and psychologically aware. Sarah had done years of therapy, attended countless workshops, and was known among her friends as someone who always had insight into the deeper meaning of life experiences. Sarah's dark night began when she realized that all her spiritual and psychological knowledge had become a sophisticated form of spiritual materialism. She was using insights and practices not to become more authentic, but to maintain an identity as someone who was more evolved than others. This recognition precipitated a complete crisis of meaning. If her spiritual journey had been unconsciously motivated by ego rather than genuine seeking, what was authentic about any of it? If her insights were just intellectual understanding rather than lived wisdom, what did she actually know? For months, Sarah felt like everything she had believed about herself and her spiritual development was false. She couldn't engage in spiritual practices because they felt like performance. She couldn't offer insight to friends because she no longer trusted her own understanding. She felt completely alone with her own essential ignorance. But gradually, Sarah began to discover that this radical not knowing was itself a form of spiritual maturity. Without the protection of spiritual concepts and practices, she began to encounter life directly, not through the filter of what she thought she should be experiencing, but with the raw immediacy of someone who had given up pretending to understand. This direct encounter with existence, unmediated by spiritual beliefs or psychological frameworks, became the foundation for a much more authentic spiritual life. Sarah's practices became expressions of genuine seeking rather than maintenance of spiritual identity. Her insights arose from lived experience rather than intellectual understanding. Most importantly, Sarah's capacity to be with others in their suffering increased exponentially because she had learned to be with her own not knowing without trying to fix it or escape from it. This is the ultimate gift of the dark night. It teaches you to find the sacred in the absence of everything you've been told is sacred. It develops what Jung called religious function, not adherence to particular beliefs, but the capacity to remain open to mystery even in the midst of apparent meaninglessness. If you're currently experiencing spiritual loneliness, if your previous sources of meaning feel empty, if you're questioning everything you've believed about spirituality and existence, consider the possibility that you're not losing your way but finding a more authentic path. The dark night isn't punishment for spiritual inadequacy, it's invitation to spiritual maturity. It's not evidence that you've failed in your seeking. It's evidence that you're ready for a relationship with the sacred that doesn't depend on your understanding, control, or ability to maintain particular experiences. Your spiritual loneliness isn't abandonment by the divine. It's the space between one form of relationship with mystery and another, deeper form that can embrace even doubt, confusion, and apparent meaninglessness. The way through the dark night isn't around it, but through it. Not by trying to restore your previous spiritual understanding, but by learning to find the sacred in the darkness itself. Not by seeking new answers, but by learning to live authentically with the questions. And on the other side of this spiritual loneliness, you may discover what the mystics have always known, that the divine is most present precisely when it seems most absent, that meaning can be found in meaninglessness, and that the deepest spiritual connections often require the death of everything you thought spirituality was supposed to be. One of the most profound realizations that emerges from periods of sacred solitude is this: your capacity for authentic relationship is directly proportional to your capacity for being genuinely alone. The people who struggle most with loneliness are often those who have never learned to distinguish between connection and codependence, between genuine intimacy and mutual need fulfillment, between love and attachment. Jung understood that most of what we call relationship is actually projection. We don't truly see the other person, but rather use them as a screen upon which to project our own unmet needs, unconscious desires, and disowned aspects of self. True relationship, the kind that nourishes the soul rather than depleting it, requires two people who have each developed enough inner stability to show up as themselves rather than as performances designed to meet the other's expectations. This is why periods of chosen solitude, rather than isolating you from authentic connection, actually prepare you for relationships that feed your soul instead of consuming it. When you've learned to meet your own needs for companionship, validation, and emotional regulation, you can approach others from fullness rather than emptiness, from curiosity rather than neediness, from choice rather than compulsion. Let me tell you about Rebecca and James, a couple whose marriage was transformed by understanding this principle. They had been together for 12 years, and by all external measures, their relationship was successful. They rarely fought, shared similar values, and were known among their friends as a particularly harmonious couple. But beneath the surface harmony, both Rebecca and James were slowly suffocating. Their relationship had become a carefully choreographed dance of mutual accommodation, where each person had learned to anticipate and meet the other's needs, while gradually losing touch with their own authentic desires and feelings. Rebecca realized the problem first when she noticed that she couldn't make simple decisions: what to have for dinner, which movie to watch, how to spend the weekend, without first considering James's preferences. She had become so attuned to keeping him happy that she had lost all contact with what she actually wanted. James, meanwhile, had noticed that he felt increasingly resentful and suffocated by Rebecca's constant accommodation. Her willingness to always defer to his preferences had initially seemed loving, but over time it began to feel like a burden. He wanted to be in relationship with a real person, not someone who had dissolved her own identity in service of his comfort. The crisis came when Rebecca mentioned that she was thinking about taking a pottery class, and James immediately began planning how he could adjust his schedule to drive her there, pick her up, and make sure she felt supported in this new interest. Rebecca's response shocked them both. "I don't want you to support me. I want to do something that's just mine." This moment of honest expression broke open their entire relational pattern. They realized that their harmony had been achieved through mutual self-abandonment rather than authentic connection. They were relating to idealized versions of each other rather than to the complex, sometimes difficult, but ultimately more interesting reality of who they actually were. Working with a therapist who understood Jungian principles, Rebecca and James began what they came to call relationship individuation, the process of becoming authentic individuals within the context of their partnership, rather than losing themselves in unconscious merger. This process required both of them to spend significant time alone, reacquainting themselves with their own preferences, desires, and boundaries that had been buried under years of mutual accommodation. Rebecca discovered that she was actually more introverted than she had been pretending to be, and needed regular solitary time to feel centered and clear. James realized that his people-pleasing tendencies had prevented him from ever expressing disagreement or authentic emotional responses to Rebecca's choices. The individuation process was initially threatening to their relationship because it revealed how much of their connection had been based on unconscious agreements to not be fully themselves. Rebecca's increasing comfort with solitude made James anxious about being rejected. James's growing willingness to express disagreement made Rebecca feel criticized and unloved. But as they each developed more authentic self-knowledge through periods of chosen solitude, something remarkable happened. They began to genuinely see each other for the first time. Without the familiar patterns of accommodation and people-pleasing, they encountered each other as separate, complex individuals with their own inner lives, struggles, and authentic expressions. This was initially disorienting. They had to learn to relate to each other as real people rather than as familiar roles they had unconsciously agreed to play. But it was also profoundly enlivening. Their conversations became more interesting because each person had something authentic to contribute. Their physical intimacy deepened because they were no longer performing connection, but expressing it from genuine attraction to who the other person actually was. Most importantly, their individual growth began to feed their relationship rather than threatening it. Rebecca's pottery practice became a source of creative fulfillment that made her more interesting and engaged when she was with James. James's willingness to express authentic reactions created space for real dialogue rather than polite agreement. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of relationship as the encounter between two individuating persons, rather than the merger of two incomplete halves seeking wholeness through union. Authentic relationship requires what he called sacred boundaries, the capacity to maintain your own center while remaining open to genuine connection with another's center. Sacred boundaries are different from defensive walls. Walls are built to keep others out and protect you from vulnerability. Sacred boundaries are permeable membranes that allow for authentic exchange while maintaining your essential integrity. They let love in and keep manipulation out. They create space for intimacy while preserving individuality. People who have not learned to be comfortably alone often have very poor boundaries because they use relationships to fill internal voids rather than to express authentic connection. They say yes when they mean no because they're afraid of being abandoned. They accommodate others' preferences because they haven't developed their own. They avoid conflict because they mistake peace for love. But individuals who have cultivated sacred solitude develop what Jung called differentiated boundaries. They can be close without losing themselves, intimate without becoming dependent, loving without being possessive. They don't need relationships to feel complete, so they can choose relationships that enhance their completeness rather than fill their emptiness. Consider the story of Michael, a man who had spent years in what he thought were loving relationships but gradually realized were actually mutual dependency arrangements. Michael's pattern was to become completely absorbed in his romantic partner's lives, interests, and problems. He would lose himself so completely in trying to understand and support them that he would forget he had his own needs, interests, and inner life. This pattern felt loving to Michael because it gave him a sense of purpose and connection, but it consistently led to relationships where he felt resentful and unappreciated, and his partners eventually felt suffocated by his intensity and neediness. The change began when Michael's most recent relationship ended with his partner telling him, "I feel like you're trying to live my life for me. I don't need you to solve my problems or understand everything about me. I need you to have your own life so that we have something real to share." This feedback was devastating because Michael had thought his total devotion was what love looked like, but it prompted him to examine whether his relationship patterns were actually expressions of love or sophisticated forms of self-abandonment designed to avoid the anxiety of being genuinely separate from another person. Michael began spending time alone not to recover from his breakup, but to discover who he was when he wasn't defining himself in relation to a romantic partner. This was terrifying initially because Michael had used relationships to avoid ever being truly alone with himself. But as Michael developed comfort with solitude, He began to rediscover interests, opinions, and desires that had been buried under years of relationship merger. He remembered that he loved hiking, which none of his previous partners had enjoyed, so he had given up. He realized he had strong political opinions that he had learned to moderate or hide to avoid conflict with partners who disagreed. Most importantly, Michael discovered that he was actually quite interesting and enjoyable company for himself. He developed hobbies, friendships, and activities that were entirely his own, rather than shared with or oriented around a romantic partner. When Michael eventually entered his next relationship, the difference was profound. Instead of immediately trying to merge with his new partner's life, he maintained his own interests, friendships, and activities. Instead of trying to solve her problems, he listened and offered support, while respecting her autonomy. Instead of accommodating all her preferences, he expressed his own and negotiated genuine compromises. This approach initially felt selfish to Michael because he had confused self-abandonment with love for so many years. But his new partner responded to his authentic presence and clear boundaries with much more respect and genuine affection than he had ever received when he was trying to be whatever she needed him to be. The relationship that emerged from Michael's increased capacity for solitude was characterized by what Jung called conscious relationship, connection between two people who choose to be together rather than need to be together, who enhance each other's individual development rather than impede it, who love the reality of who the other person is rather than their fantasy of who they might become. This transformation illustrates a fundamental principle that our culture misunderstands. Healthy relationships require healthy individuals, and healthy individuals require the capacity for genuine solitude. You cannot give what you don't have, and you cannot love authentically from emptiness. The quality of your relationships is directly related to your comfort with being alone because self-knowledge enables authentic expression. When you know yourself through periods of solitude, you have something authentic to share rather than just reflecting what others want to see. Inner stability prevents projective relationships. When you're comfortable alone, you don't need others to fill internal voids, so you can see them as they are rather than as what you need them to be. Boundary awareness prevents codependence. Understanding your own needs and limits through solitude enables you to maintain appropriate boundaries and relationship. Choice rather than compulsion. When you enjoy your own company, relationships become choices rather than desperate attempts to escape loneliness. Individual growth feeds relational growth. When both people in a relationship maintain connection to their individual development through regular solitude, they have ongoing new material to bring to their connection. Sacred boundaries in relationship might look like regular solitude time. Both individuals maintain practices of chosen aloneness that allow them to stay connected to their authentic self. Separate interests. Each person cultivates activities, friendships, and interests that are entirely their own rather than shared. Emotional responsibility. Each person takes responsibility for their own emotional regulation rather than making their partner responsible for their feelings. Authentic expression. Both individuals express their genuine thoughts, feelings, and desires rather than performing what they think the other wants to hear. Respectful disagreement. Differences are explored and negotiated rather than avoided or accommodated away. Support without enabling. Each person offers support while respecting the other's autonomy and capacity to handle their own challenges. The goal isn't to become independent to the point of not needing anyone, but to become interdependent, choosing connection from fullness rather than seeking it from emptiness. This creates relationships that enhance both individuals rather than diminishing either one.